Deter China by giving tons of weapons to Ukraine? That may sound like a loose connection, but today I'm bringing the data. Let me explain. Vladimir Putin's recent trip to China highlights the continued coordination between Moscow and Beijing. Undoubtedly, a major topic of conversation between Xi and Putin was the $95 billion aid package that Washington approved in April. Although the $61 billion intended to assist Ukraine dominated the headlines, Kyiv was not the only beneficiary of that piece of legislation. We discussed in the immediate aftermath how the bill itself was part of a larger compromise package between House Republicans and the president. And we more recently tackled the consequences of any forthcoming seizures of Russian assets. Today, though, we focus not only on what the bill does in terms of the People's Republic of China, but also Washington's ongoing efforts in general to deter any invasion of Taiwan. Now, you may already know that the bill included $8 billion in aid directed toward the island. And yeah, that will buy a lot of additional power in the region. But the underappreciated source of deterrence actually lies back in the aid given to Ukraine. Not necessarily because of the direct military effects, but rather because of how it influences perceptions in Beijing. We have freshly released research on the subject, so now is as good of a time as any to examine this in greater depth. Thus, today, we will begin with the indirect military benefits that Taiwan receives from Ukraine's aid package. Then we will explore what the US aid specifically earmarked for Taiwan does, before reaching the meat of today's story, the political signaling effects directed toward China of sending military aid to Ukraine, how this is distinct from the broader signals of economic catastrophe that the West has broadcast throughout the war, what the PRC's government thinks about all of this, and some experimental evidence that shows that PRC citizens believe that the former category of signals is more important than the latter category of signals. But we begin with the indirect military benefits of Ukrainian aid, which may seem strange for anyone coming into this blind, as well as anyone paying very close attention to the military situations in both regions. For those indeed coming in blind, this is weird because it seems like the $61 billion in aid is directed toward Ukraine, and not directed toward Taiwan. However, much of the bill is designed to clear warehouse space for new American weapons, and create new production capacity. Conceivably, those assembly lines can generate output that can go anywhere. So yes, today the intended recipient for right now is Ukraine, though tomorrow it could just as easily become Taiwan. But then you think about it a little bit more, and the story becomes blurry once again. This is a land war in Europe after all. In contrast, if you take a look at a map, it is clear that the obvious main battle space between Taiwan and the PRC would be at sea. As a result, the infrastructure expansion in the Ukraine aid bill would seem to not universally help Taiwan. And depending on how a war might play out between the two, that could very well be true. But the reality here is probably more complicated. The Taiwan Strait is notorious for its turbulent weather conditions. Thus, there is some chance that Beijing may forego a sea landing entirely, and instead opt for air landings. This would lead to a large-scale version of the Battle of Hostomel Airport, a callback to the opening hours of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At that point, artillery is exactly what Taiwan would need. And even in the event of an amphibious landing, Taiwan does not exactly plan to immediately concede to the People's Liberation Army. Beyond the 155mm shells, Taiwan also has demand for Abrams tanks to push the mainland back, just as is the case in Ukraine. More subtly, though, HIMARS is a major part of the conversation. One component of the Ukraine aid bill is to donate M777 towed howitzers to Ukraine to free up development for more HIMARS production. Remember, the missiles used by HIMARS launchers are designed for long-distance strikes, which has allowed Ukraine to hit targets well behind Russian lines. Now, given the rather small and narrow geography of the island of Taiwan, you might speculate that the distance factor here is overkill. However, Taiwan disagrees. The Republic of China Armed Forces ordered 11 HIMARS launchers in 2020, along with 64 ATACMS missiles. Remember, HIMARS is the truck, ATACMS is one of the options for the thing that goes boom. And following HIMARS battlefield successes in Ukraine, Taiwan added 18 more to the order in 2023. The trick here is that, at its narrowest, the Taiwan Strait is about 140 kilometers wide, or about 87 freedom distances, or heck, 76 nautical miles for you sailors out there. Meanwhile, at its widest, the strait goes to 220 kilometers. ATACMS has a range of 300 kilometers, meaning that Taiwan can hit all of the cross-strait PRC coastline, as well as some inland targets. What's more, you may have heard about a sudden influx of ATACMS strikes on Russian targets. Again, the reason for this is that, rather than turning into parts are us, the United States is deliberately trying to clear off its shelves, because precision strike missiles began rolling off the assembly lines in December 2023. These are abbreviated PRSM, apparently because they ran out of the good acronyms when ATACMS came out. Nevertheless, precision strike missiles are the next evolution in HIMARS munitions. The main innovation of note here is an increase in range to 499 kilometers. Now, if you are thinking to yourself, gee, that is an oddly specific range. So specific, it's suspicious. Well, then congratulations, you are right. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, banned ground-launch missiles with ranges of 500 kilometers and beyond. So when bidding began to build precision strike missiles in 2016, the range was capped at 499 kilometers. However, Trump pulled out of the INF treaty in 2019, citing Russian non-compliance. That said, Trump was not the only one with concerns. Indeed, reservations were raised about the treaty going back to the Obama administration, with the issue raised then that China was not a party of it. Military strategists worried that the INF treaty specifically handicapped the United States along the Taiwan Strait. As a result, testing from the Department of Defense to extend precision strike missiles to 1,000 kilometers is already underway. But whether the distance is 499 kilometers or 1,000, Taiwan would get a lot of use out of them if a conflict with the PRC were to ever begin. Still, the direct benefits to Taiwan lie in the $8 billion aid package, meant specifically for the island. These funds are more focused at the primary stage of any battle between the parties, specifically denying the People's Liberation Army from making landfall along Taiwan's beaches. That means preparing for a naval war with China within the Taiwan Strait. To take some steps in that direction, the bill earmarks $3.3 billion for American submarine building. $1.9 billion of that is specifically for a Columbia-class submarine. These do not actually exist yet, and so what you are seeing now is the official Navy concept art. If that wasn't clear, just take a look at these sailors. Very real. Anyway, as a result, we are going to be stuck with silly AI images from here forward. The first sub within the Columbia class is not scheduled for completion until about 2030, so this is a long game play. And another $200 billion goes toward a Virginia-class submarine. But this is far from a simple fix. Keep in mind that a single Columbia-class submarine might cost something like $8 billion, which I guess makes sense if there is going to be a Ferris wheel on the back of them. Meanwhile, a single Virginia-class submarine costs about $3.4 billion, so neither of those allotments are going to build a complete vessel. Another $2 billion is going toward foreign military financing, spread out across the many U.S. partners in the region. That allows those countries to go on shopping sprees within the U.S. catalog, to order what they believe will be most important for them. For the next line item, $1.9 billion replenishes American warehouses of materiel that has already been sent away. And finally, there is a nebulous $542 million to go toward the DoD's own expenditures in the region. Have fun speculating about that. The reactions to the US bill were predictable. Taiwan was pleased as usual to be receiving more support, while Beijing worried that it put the entire region in grave danger. But there is a more subtle effect within the larger congressional bill, the political signal that military aid sent to Ukraine conveys to Beijing. If any given country wants to deter a second country from taking a particular action, then broadly there are two options available. First, you make taking the action more expensive. Second, you lower the probability of success, or limit what might be turned over conditional on success. Basically, these are the two sides of a standard cost-benefit analysis coin. Make the cost-benefit lower than what the actor gets by taking no action, and congratulations, you have deterred them. Looking at the bigger picture, US partners in the region want to convince China that attacking Taiwan would indeed generate high costs and come with few benefits. One way to do this is to signal commitment to maintaining the status quo by defending it elsewhere, like, for example, in Ukraine. The military aid sent to Ukraine serves as a warning that Taiwan will get similar assistance in the event of a conflict in the Asian theater. Now, is that signal today as strong as it would have been if the aid had been sent 6 months ago? No, and that has been a major complaint in Taiwan. But it is better than nothing. Like the Churchill saying goes, even though there is no evidence that Churchill actually said it, Americans will always do the right thing, only after they have tried everything else. And, truth be told, from Beijing's perspective, there may be little difference between aid now and aid 6 months ago. More on that in a moment. First, if we take a step back and think about the economic consequences of Russia's invasion, a natural question to ask is whether the military aid matters. Remember, from a cost-benefit standpoint, China's calculus is benefits minus costs. Military aid to Ukraine has greater influence on beliefs regarding the benefits. The new information from the US aid bill suggests that they will be smaller. But one might argue that this new information is irrelevant. That is, the PRC's costs of an invasion are already so high that any changes in beliefs about the benefits only matters at the margins. In other words, Beijing may already see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as generating a Pyrrhic victory in the best-case scenario, and so it is deterred from doing anything similar to Taiwan. And thus, we have a tricky asymmetry in timing. Part of what caused the invasion of Ukraine is Russia's initial belief that it would go well. However, conditional on having been invaded, a Pyrrhic victory for Russia means little to Kyiv if Ukraine as a country ceases to exist. But suppose that Taiwan and the West can convince the PRC that at best an invasion of the island would cost more than it would be worth before such an invasion might take place. Then increasing the PRC's perceived costs are just as good as decreasing the PRC's perceived benefits, at least from Taiwan's perspective. Okay, but what does the PRC government think of all of this? Good question. We don't know. Maybe they do. Then again, maybe not. But there are some things that we do know that might help us triangulate Beijing's position here. There is no doubt that the PRC has paid great attention to what sanctions have done to the Russian economy. And this is a significant pain point. Xi Jinping, like other recent Chinese leaders, bases the legitimacy of his rule on the competency of the Chinese Communist Party. In particular, officials can point to China's economic growth as a good justification for their continued governance. If the PRC were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, though, all of that goes out the window. There is also a fair bit of speculation that Beijing is worried about the military situation. We covered this topic more than a year ago, but the basics remain the same. The war has made Beijing nervous that seemingly simple military campaigns can go drastically awry. There also seems to be some level of annoyance that Russia, which helps to serve as a counterbalance to the West, has encountered so many strategic setbacks. That helps explain why China is happy to profit from the war, but is not looking to encourage the Kremlin further. Profit from cheap oil? Yes, please. Sell dual-use civilian goods and help skirt the sanctions regime? Sure. Outright offload arms to Russia? No. At least not yet. Lots of controversy there, though. Just one more thing to keep an eye on. Anyway, the war has demonstrated to the PRC that, absent a quick win, Western allies will deliver the invading country an unpleasant experience, even if it is not a forceful response. And that is why the delay in aid might not actually matter much. From Ukraine's perspective, yes, getting Russia out as soon as possible is a top priority. By comparison, though, the West places relatively more weight on strategic setbacks for Russia, and the aid has been effective in that regard. This is something along the lines of indicating that the West will make the costs miserably high for China, even given a successful invasion. And, from the perspective of deterring the action from starting in the first place, that is just as effective of a strategy. Okay, so that all necessarily required a fair bit of speculation. But we can say something a little firmer about how PRC citizens actually feel, thanks to some freshly published research. Now, to preface this, China is an autocratic government, so a natural question to ask is whether we should focus exclusively on what goes on behind the curtain and completely ignore Chinese public opinion. Well, obviously, we should care less about the public discourse there than we would in a democracy. But China is not North Korea. Any sort of incursion into Taiwan will require some level of support from the broader Chinese public, although that is made easier with a Great Firewall and media control. Default Chinese citizens' beliefs determine what will be easy and what will be an uphill battle for the CCP. With that caveat out of the way, the researchers conducted 2 experiments, one in June 2022 and a second in June 2023. To situate ourselves, the first was after Russia's failed assault on Kyiv, but before Ukraine's successful 2022 counteroffensives, while the second was after the start of Ukraine's 2023 offensive, but before it became clear that it was going to be a dud. And though it would be nice to have some more recent data, such as the slow nature of peer review, that pure jokes aside, International Organization is actually the hardest international relations journal to publish in. Anyway, in both surveys, members of the Chinese public read a short news story about Russia's invasion. Okay, that probably was not helpful, so I will just stick with the English translations from now on, at least for the most part. Afterward, they were asked about their support for using military force to reunify Taiwan. However, a random portion of respondents were given additional information about Western economic countermeasures, and another random portion were given additional information about Western military countermeasures. So, 3 randomly assigned groups that we care about. No extra information, sanctions information, and military aid information. Now, you would think that attitudes regarding relying on military strength to reunify Taiwan would be strongest in the baseline category, with the other 2, where there are actual punishments, being lower. So the interesting question is how much lower these 2 categories go, and whether one is a relatively stronger deterrent as compared to the other. Sure enough, baseline support was 56.4% in the first experiment, and 66% in the second. Add in the economic sanctions warning, and they drop to 52.2% and 63.1%. So there is a modest drop-off in both cases, but it is hard to distinguish the difference between the 2. However, the military aid warning drops the first to 47.2%, and the second to 60.5%. Those differences start to look noticeable. In other words, if you want to influence public opinion in China, you really want the military aid to flow. Why is that the case? Well, I suspect it has something to do with the ease of understanding macroeconomics versus things that go boom. For example, the sanctions treatment discussed cutting off Russian banks from the SWIFT system. Didn't even need the translation there. Not to be confused with a pop princess, SWIFT is the messaging platform that financial institutions use to communicate with each other to initiate transactions. If what that actually means sounds opaque, well, that's because it is. To get a benchmark, I asked viewers if they knew what Swift does, and a full 39% of you admitted that you do not. If 39% of people who go out of their way to watch glorified versions of university lectures, produced by a PhD who evidently has way too much free time, you can imagine how much a random respondent in China would know about Swift. Of course, those same respondents might feel differently once push comes to shove and China's economy spirals into oblivion. But such are the natural limitations of hypothetical survey experiments. In contrast, things that go boom are just more relatable, because you can actually see the explosions right in front of you. So, in summary, if the United States wants to dissuade the Chinese public, which may then have a tangible effect on the government's thinking, it appears that it is better to do so kinetically, and not financially. And that is why the Ukraine aid bill has effects that go far beyond the European continent. Meanwhile, if you want to watch my books go boom, just sit back and enjoy, or check the video description for more information about unexploded copies. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.